This is a shir on Likutei Sichos, Chelek Chaf, the 20th book of Likutei Sichos, the Sicha Vayechi, the third Sicha Vayechi. In the end of, and this is also the last Sicha of the book, volume 20. In the end of the Parsha of the Seder of Vayechi, Rashi comments on what it says, speaking about the glorious 17 years that Yaakov spent in Egypt together with Yosef, and of course the glory of Jewish life is that there are children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So it speaks about the nachas that Yosef had from his children. It says, the pasuk in full says, Vayar Yosef livnei Ephraim, that Yosef merited to see Ephraim have great-grandchildren. So that's great-grandchildren of Yosef. Gam b'nei Machir b'Menashe yuldu al Birkei Yosef. Also, the children of Machir, the child of Menashe, were raised on the knees of Yosef, which means that Yosef got to see great-grandchildren from his son Menashe, raised great-grandchildren of his son Menashe, and he got to see great-grandchildren from his son Ephraim. Okay, so Rashi comments. It says that also the children of Machir, the son of Menashe, were born on the knees of Yosef. It says, what does it mean they were born on the knees of Yosef? Kitargumai, like the Targum Onkelos says, Gidlon ben Birkov, he raised them between his knees, literally. Simply speaking, we learn that by Rashi, why does Rashi have to comment on this pasuk? Rashi is commenting because of the difficulty in understanding what does it mean that they were born al birkei Yosef. They were born on the knees of Yosef. Yosef wasn't a birthing room. I mean, they were born on the knees of Yosef. So it means that it means, like the Targum says, that Gidlon ben Birkov, he raised them between his knees. Okay. However, we have to understand this itself. The way Rashi chooses to interpret this pasuk really could be learned in two ways. First of all, way one is like the Even Ezra, who learns that what it says that they were born on the knees of Yosef, it means that they were raised. The word yuldu, born, doesn't mean birthed, it means raised. Or you could explain this, the literal translation of this pasuk, like the Targum says on these words. The Targum says that they were born, is yilidu, in Aramaic means they were born, v'ravi Yosef, and Yosef raised them. So that would mean to say that there's two parts in translating this verse. Also, the sons of Machir, the sons of Menashe, were born, and al birkei Yosef, they were then raised on the knees of Yosef. Okay, Rashi doesn't learn that the word that they were born and on the knees of Yosef, Rashi does not learn like the Ibn Ezra that the word born here is simply a substitute for raised. Rashi learns like the Targum. There's a born, they're born to their mother. And then there's a raised on the knees of Yosef. He raised them on his knees. So we have to understand, why does Rashi take that approach rather than what seems to be the simpler approach is in translating these words? Just a question about translation. That he saw the grandchildren of Menashe, and they were raised rather than they were born, and then raised by Yosef, say they were raised by Yosef. Just the word yuldu, were born, can have an allegoric meaning, raised. So we want to understand, why does Rashi choose to go the longer route? Now you can't answer, because how can you say that the word used for birthing could be a code word for raising? That's not a question. Rashi has already let us know later on, when the Torah describes the children of Aaron and Moshe, and the verse reads fascinatingly in the book of Shmos later on, these are the children of, in the book of Bamidbar, these are the children of Aaron and Moshe, and then it goes to list the children of Aaron. So Rashi there comments, you're talking about the children of Aaron and Moshe, then you say only the children of Aaron? They're not the children of Moshe. He says, no, they are, because Moshe taught them Torah. Anybody who teaches somebody else Torah, even if they're the physical birth child of somebody else, it's as if he gave birth to them. So we see that in the context of pshat, In the literal translation of Torah, there is license to say that somebody giving birth to somebody else means that somebody else raised them, taught them Torah. Taught them Torah is just one facet of raising a child. So even if we even say that teaching a child Torah can be referred to in the Torah as being a child, for sure, if somebody totally takes responsibility to raise somebody else's child, we can refer to it allegorically in the Torah as birthing that child. So the fact that the Torah here says that Yosef raised these children between his knees, that could be a translation of birthed them. Allegorically gave birth to them because he raised them. But the Rashi doesn't go that way. Rashi says they were born to their mothers, and then they were raised, the second part of the pasuk, al birke Yosef, on the knees of Yosef. That's a second concept that he raised them. Why doesn't Rashi just take the simpler route to explain that the children were raised by Yosef? That's why they're called being born on the knees of Yosef. Paragraph 2, the explanation is as follows. In the portion of Vayechi, a couple of weeks ago, where Rachel says she sees she's not having children, Leah has children. So she says, you know what? Yaakov, get married to my half-sister, to my maidservant. She will have children. When she has children, they will be on my knees. V'teled al birkai. She will give birth on my knees. What does that mean? Rashi says, comments there, like the Targum, I will raise them. The word they will be born on my knees doesn't mean literally they'll be born to me. It means I will raise them. There you cannot say that the birthing is going on Rachel, because clearly the child is born. She's talking about a child being born to her servant Bilhah. So what does v'teled mean? That the child will be born. And then al birkai, on my knees, means that I will raise the child on my knees. So that's what it means, this concept, v'teled and al birkai, when we have the two juxtaposed concepts, giving birth and knees. It's talking about the child being birthed by a birth mother, not allegorically being raised by the person who raised them, but being born. And then the knees part is an expression of raising the child. In that case, Rachel said, I will raise the child, will be like my child. In our parsha, it also says similar that Yosef gave birth to the grandchildren of Machir on his knees. It means the same thing. They were given birth to by their parents, and then Yosef would raise them on his knees. Okay, so we understand why Rashi says what he says here. It fits with the way he's translated already the pasuk, and he had to translate the similar pasuk with children being born to Bilhah and then being raised by Rachel. Similarly here, they're born to their parents, raised by Yosef. Paragraph 3, what we do have to understand, however, is why Rashi seems to be belaboring a point, because he speaks at greater length than he really needed to, seemingly. The first point that we have to pay attention to is like this. The way of Rashi in many places, when he says that I'm quoting, I want you to learn this pasuk like it is in the Targum, in the Onkelos translation, all he says is, Ket Targumai, like the Targum. And he assumes every 5-year-old has access to the Aramaic translation of Onkelos. He'll take a look, he'll see what the translation is. Here, Rashi actually quotes the Targum. Not just he quotes the Targum, he also explains the Targum. He says, Al Birkai, he says, like it's Targum, and I will raise them. That's what the word Birkai means, knees, just like I'll raise them on my knees. So we not understand, why does Rashi have to explain the Targum into Hebrew, and he says that he raised them between the knees. I mean, we understand what Ano Arabe means. We assume the 5-year-old understands Aramaic, basic Aramaic. And if he needs to explain this Aramaic, why didn't he explain it a few chapters ago, a few parshas ago, where we spoke about the birth of children to Bilhah, where the same language is used in the Targum? Rashi doesn't translate it into Hebrew. That it means Ana Arave means I will raise them. Even point number 2, even if you want to say that Rashi for some reason has to explain the Aramaic here, that the word Rave means to raise them, it's not understood. Why does he have to again quote the words from the Torah? I will raise them between my knees. Just say, I will raise them. The Torah said, Al birkai, on my knees. We would understand raising them is knees. Why does Rashi have to fully flesh it out again? And by the way, the addition seems to be different than what the pasuk says. The pasuk says Al birkei Yosef, on the knees of Yosef, and the Targum says that Yosef raised them on his knees. Yet when Rashi translates and unpacks that Targum, he says, I will raise them between my knees. How does that work? You added something that seems to be not like the Targum. The Targum says that Yosef raised them on his knees. Rashi translates the Targum and unpacks the Targum and speaks about raising them between his knees. What's the difference? What's the difference? Between the knees, on the knees. There's a difference. We would seemingly say why Rashi speaks about between the knees, while the pasuk speaks on the knees, is because Rashi is trying to tell us that when the Targum says raised on the knees of Yosef, it means being raised literally. How do you raise a child, a young child? You put him on your knees, right? That's very often the way you raise a child. But putting your kids on your knees is a big part of holding them in your lap. That's a big part of raising a child. So Rashi wants to say that it's not just on the knees. Rashi explains that what the Targum means is also between the knees. What's the difference between the knees and on the knees? What happens when a child stands? You hold a child in your lap when they can't stand. When a child stands, then they can now stand next to you between your knees. They don't have to be on your knees. The child can't move. The child can't stand. You have to hold him on your knees. So what Rashi is possibly trying to tell us here is that he actually raised these grandchildren well beyond the age that they would have to be on his lap. He raised them also that they were between his knees. In other words, he raised them as they were able to be self-sufficient and stand on their own. What we have to understand is that if Rashi wants to tell us that the Targum also means not just the stage of development where they have to sit on the lap, but rather between the knees as well, if that's the case, that's what it means. Al birkai, it doesn't mean, Rashi trying to say the Targum, when you translate I will raise the child, doesn't limit it to being on the lap, but even between the knees, even at the later stage. Why doesn't Rashi say the same thing when he speaks about the birth of children to Bilah, where the same language is used? Rashi does not create that distinction that say, when Rachel says, and the children will be born and then they'll be raised on my knees, on my lap, Rashi doesn't go and say that really it means between the knees as well. Why only over here does he make this point? So the explanation is as follows, paragraph 4. By adding these additional words, this additional detail that he raised them between his knees, Rashi wants to educate us not to learn, to negate something you could have learned. Not a mistaken way, but another avenue in reading this pasuk, and that's an alternate Targum translation, but not the Aramaic translation of Onkelos, but the translation attributed to the famous Tana Yonatan ben Uziel, called Targum Yonatan. The Targum Yonatan, which is also referred to as the Jerusalem Targum translation, he says as follows: what does it mean to give birth on the knees? He said that when these children were born, his great-grandchildren, the grandchildren of Menashe, they were cut, literally, on the knees of Yosef. When is a boy cut? A bris. His bris of those great-grandchildren were held on the knees of Yosef, which means he was their sandak, the position we have in a bris, which is to hold the child when he's having the bris, a very great honor. Yosef was given and accorded that honor to his great-grandchildren. What nachas? That's what the Targum Yonatan says is the meaning, that they were born on the knees of Yosef. And that seems to fit much better in the literal translation of the pasuk. You know why? Because now, if we learn that way, that they had their bris and they were being held on the knees of Yosef because Yosef was their sandak, then what happens is we're saying that literally they were on the knees. Also, we're saying they were born on the knees. The word born here fits much more naturally. Why does the word born fit much more naturally? Because the birth of a child, what is the birth of a child? When we go to the Targum Onkelos, we say that they were raised, right? The babies were born and then raised between the knees of Yosef. Okay, that means that he saw them, he raised them, but it doesn't answer why it's telling us that they were also born on the knees of Yosef. We have to say they were born and they were raised by Yosef. But that word born doesn't really have any relevance in the way we learned the Targum Onkelos. The Targum Yonatan, when we say that they actually were given a bris on the knees of Yosef, who was the Sandik, it fits much more the word born on the knees. You know why? Because the bris is in proximity to the birth. Moreover, says the Rebbe in a footnote, that the Rambam says the reason, the Rambam in the Guide for the Perplexed says, the reason for the bris at 8 days is because that's when the child is really emerges from the womb. The first 7 days is so close to birth, it's as if the baby is still in the birthing process. It still hasn't emerged fully from the womb. So now the bris is really the declaration and the full statement of birth once the child stands on its own with more independence. So the birth really is happening at the bris. It's really first of all, it's in proximity, and it's actually an expression of the birth. So the pasuk would fit much better. So why doesn't Rashi go with that explanation? He doesn't, but why not? Seems to be perfect way to learn it. Point 3, and here's the main point. It's more. Makes more sense to say that Yosef was the one-time sandak. In other words, being a sandak, holding a great-grandchild at the bris, takes about half an hour, however long the ceremony takes, 5 minutes, half hour. It depends when you count the ceremony starting. But that's a one-time thing. He took off a couple of hours for a personal simcha. He told Paro's court, sorry, I got to take some time off for the birth of the family. I've been accorded the honor to be the sandak. That makes much more sense rather than to say that he actually took busy time off his schedule and raised his great-grandchild. We know that his position of in the royal palace was one of being the actual total, the main executive of the kingdom, to the extent it says nobody was able to lift his arm or his foot in Egypt to get arms or other things. You couldn't do anything without Yosef signing off on it. So where do you have time to raise his great-grandchild? If you learn that he was the sandik, that makes much more sense. So that's why, even though we already know what Rashi told us, that when Rachel says Bilhah should have children from Yaakov, and then they will be born and I will raise them, so we know how the verse there is translated and fits with the Targum. Rashi can't rely that this is the way we'll understand it here too, that the children will be born to their children, to their mothers and fathers, and then Yosef as the great-grandfather will raise them. That Rashi says, if I don't tell you that this is what it means here, you would naturally gravitate to the translation of the Targum Yonasan, which is that it just means a one-time event, that he was the sandik, he held them on his knees when they were circumcised. So Rashi says, I want you to know that in this verse, it means that they were raised, like the Targum says here as well, they were born and then raised on the knees, between the knees of Yosef. So now you want to know how does Rashi know that that's what the pasuk means or should mean to the 5-year-old? Why doesn't he go with a sandak narrative? Paragraph 5. So in the pasuk that says that Yosef, let's read the whole pasuk and analyze it. Yosef saw to Ephraim 3 generations of children. He saw Ephraim have great-grandchildren. In other words, Ephraim is the son of Yosef. If he sees Ephraim have 3 generations, he saw Ephraim have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. That means Yosef got to see his great-grandchildren from Ephraim. Oh, that's pretty amazing. That's like epic. Continues the pasuk. Also, the children of Machir, the children of Menashe, the son of Menashe. In other words, also the grandchildren of Menashe were born on the knees of Yosef. Also, the grandchildren of Menashe are the great grandchildren of Yosef. They were also born on the knees of Yosef. So, one second. What's more exciting? Seeing great grandchildren or seeing great grandchildren? So, why does the pasuk first say he saw great grandchildren from Menashe, from Ephraim, and the also sounds like something even better. He also saw great grandchildren from Menashe. Hello. He saw great grandchildren from Ephraim. What's the new piece of information? Well, he also saw something even greater. Great grandchildren from Menashe. Says Rashi, you know what the pasuk is telling us? In the way the Targum reads that he raised those children. The Torah is telling us he raised the grandchildren, the great grandchildren from Menashe. He's saying he didn't just see them, which could be he saw them and he was very old and hoary, very old man. And he saw the kids as they're being born, great grandchildren. Then he passed away. No, this is far greater. That Yosef was part of the process of raising his great grandchildren. Not just did he see his great grandchildren, he was even part of the process of raising his great grandchildren, not just to the point where they were on his knees, little kids, to the point they were between his knees, to the point they were already grown-ups, and he was raising them. Wow, that means he had real nachas. He got to be involved in raising his great grandchildren. So this is the way the Rebbe explains, unpacks a simple, innocuous word of Rashi, where he explains what does it mean that Yosef, the children of this grandchildren through Menashe, were born on the knees of Yosef. Rashi, like the Targum, it looks like the Targum just trying to explain the words. Rebbe says that the Targum opens up a whole wealth and a breadth to explain to you how the pasuk, how you can understand what the nuance or what the novelty of the pasuk is. He saw great grandchildren from Ephraim, and he also got the opportunity to raise his great grandchildren to an age of development. We had a mature interaction with his great grandchildren, which is incredible. Now comes the Rebbe and says there's a couple other things that we get to learn from these psukim. Paragraph 6. In the pasuk where it says that they were born on the knees of Yosef, whether you learn like the Targum Yonason or whether like the Onkelos Targum, there are several opportunities to learn halachic matters from this. First of all, the Alter Rebbe tells us in Shulchan Aruch that the beginning, Techilat Kinisat Nefesh HaKedosha Beguf, the beginning of the entryway of the holy Jewish neshama into the body is at the time of the circumcision. By women, it's already at birth, it would seem, because they're already, they are born as if circumcised. Whatever's achieved for a male in terms of connection to Hashem through circumcision, says Isha, the Talmud says, Kamande Mihila Damyo, a woman is born already as if she's circumcised. So this level of circumcision, the Alter Rebbe says that the neshama enters the body at the bris. That's the beginning, the final consummation of the Jewish soul entering the body. Just by the way, the Rebbe doesn't bring it here. We know is at bar mitzvah. The beginning is at the bris, which merely says, now, where does the Alter Rebbe get this? Where does he get this? He writes in the Shulchan Aruch, where is his source? So it's been explained, the Rebbe has explained elsewhere, that it would seem that there's a source in a book called Seder Hayom, which is a book from the Middle Ages. It would seem it was also a source for this, that the neshama starts coming into the Jewish soul, starts coming into the Jewish body at the bris, in a book called Menorat HaMa'or. There was a great sage, Rabbi Yisrael Alankava, who wrote a book called Menorat HaMa'or. There he writes it. There's a book, Reishis Chachma, one of the foremost books of Musar, also the Middle Ages. They seem to say, you see, there's a discussion in the Gemara. We know that there's a portion in the world to come that you have once you live. Any Jew that has lived in this world gets a portion in the world to come. The question is, how long do you have to live in this world to get a portion of the world to come? And there's an argument in the Talmud, in the Gemara. These three aforementioned early sources, they're all of the opinion that once the neshama had a bris, it now becomes a full standing Jewish existence And even if, God forbid, that child dies right after the bris, there's an allotted portion that has become theirs, and they will get their portion of the world to come. Before the bris, they're not really fully considered as if born. They're not fully considered to be full members of the Jewish community, perhaps, and therefore what it says that Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek l'olam haba, every Jew has a portion of the world to come, doesn't yet apply to them. So that would seem to be the source, halachic basis. But the Alter Rebbe tells us that at the bris, that's where the beginning of the Jewish soul comes in. But now, says the Rebbe, we can say that it's much more obvious. It's here in the Psukim. If we learn like the Targum Yonatan, which is that what? That the pasuk says they were born on the knees of Yosef because it was referring to the bris that took place on his knees. What would that be telling you? That birth is equivalent in some way to bris. Bris is birth. In what way? Because that's when the Jewish soul starts to come into the body. That's really when the child is born as a Jew in a full way, right? So we would have a source for that concept all the way in the pasuk. Beautiful. Paragraph number 7. Another thing we can learn, derive halachically from what the Targum Yonasan told us, that Yosef was the sandik. How many people was he a sandik for? Let's unpack this. There's a custom, we all know, a very well-known custom, that you shouldn't honor the same person to be a sandik twice in children that are born of the same parents. Once you got the honor of being a sandik, that's it. One time per family. Why is that? Because being a sandik for a bris, the circumcision is compared to giving ketores, to bringing incense to Hashem. Holding the baby for that wonderful special event is considered like being the Kohen who offered up the incense. When the Kohanim that offered up the incense, they were only got to do it once. The reason for that is because it had a special connection to wealth, and we wanted to spread the wealth. One Kohen had a chance to bring up the Ketores, so leave room for somebody else to get that special blessing. So therefore, we have a tradition that to be a mohel, to be a sandik, is one per family. So now we asked if the Targum Yonatan told us over here that the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren of Yosef through Menashe, were born, and means that they were circumcised on the knees of Yosef. It says it plural, not just one. It says many grandchildren from the same family were circumcised, being held by Yosef. How can that be? We have a tradition that's only one per family. We could say that this is one of the sources, and this gives credence, extra credence to what the Chassam Sofer says. The Chassam Sofer says, famously, that if somebody is a rabbi of his place, Mara Da'atra, that a Mara Da'atra, somebody who's the rabbi of his city or whatever it is, he could be a sandik more than once in the same family. Why? Because let's go back to the reason we limited to one per family. Because of the Ketoret, and we said that this Kohen didn't do Ketoret twice to leave room for as many opportunity for as many Kohanim as possible to have that opportunity at least once in their lifetime. But when it came to the Kohen Gadol, when it came to the high priest, the Kohen Gadol was able to do Ketoret whenever he wanted to. So parallel that to the Jewish communal life, the rabbi of the town is, in a sense, comparable to the highest Kohen in the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore, just like the Kohen Gadol could do more than once Ketoret, so the rabbi of the town could do more than once the bris. Where would the source for that be? So Ketoret would be a good source, but now we have another source. Yosef was the shalit al haaretz. Yosef was literally the ruler of the land. He could do more than one. There's an interesting correlation of words here. The rabbi of the place is called Mara Da'atra. The word Mara means literally the ruler, the owner or the ruler of the place. Halachically, and in Jewish conceptual understanding, the Rebbe emphasizes very much, the rabbi of a place is considered Mara Da'atra, like the leader of the place, the owner of the place, the ruler of the place. Of course, it doesn't mean physically. It means spiritually, because if the world operates through Torah, and the one who has to give the decision of how the Torah should be lived and implemented in this particular place is the rabbi, so it turns out that the rabbi is the ruler of that place in the spiritual sense. Here we're talking about Yosef, who was quite obviously the physical ruler of Mitzrayim, but also the spiritual. So there's a correlation here. If Yosef could be more than once, so the rabbi of a place can be more than once, like the Khatam Sofer said. By the way, I don't know if I've seen it ever implemented. There are Hasidic groups where their Rebbe is the Sandik, so he does it in more than one family. That's implemented in Hasidic groups. I remember growing up in Australia, I believe that, if I'm not mistaken, the senior rabbi of Melbourne, I believe at the time it was Rabbi Chaim Gutnick. I think he was a Sandik for his grandchildren, for more than one grandson in one family, if I remember correctly. But that's where I first heard as a child growing up this concept. But here the Rebbe is saying it's a Khatam Sofer. He bases it on the concept of Keteres. It's a clear halachic ruling. But really, we can see it in this pasuk. If Yosef is being a sandik more than once in the same family, you see the Torah speaks plural. They were born. In other words, the Targum Yosef learns that they were circumcised on his knees. Paragraph 8. There's something else much more significant, actually, in a sense, relevant to everybody to learn from it. We can learn from here the way Rashi and Onkelos learn here that Yosef raised the children to the stage where they were self-standing, not on his knees, but on top of his knees. And it's not about a bris, but it's about raising them. We now have an interesting look into the laws of teaching Torah. In the pasuk, it says, in the book of Devarim, that Hashem commands the Jewish people, you should teach these things, the Torah that you heard at Sinai, teach it to your children and the children of your children. So we learn from this that you have an obligation to learn Torah, not just with your children, also with the son of your son. What about the son of the son of the son? What about great-grandchildren? Grandchildren, we have an obligation, the grandfather has an obligation. What about great-grandchildren? So the law is that he's obligated to learn with the great-grandchildren only when he is such a level teacher and wise person, a chacham, that he has an obligation in general to be a teacher to students. There's an obligation on somebody who's a Talmud, who's a chacham, who's a wise person, has the ability to teach in a way that nobody else does. He has an obligation to teach. A chacham, somebody who has the ability to teach, has a responsibility to teach. So if he has the responsibility to teach in general, we now say that if he has progeny, even if they're so distant as being great grandchildren, they come first, family first. But that's only to somebody who already has an obligation to teach. You say family comes first. If, however, there are other greater people, greater, wiser people, and the teaching is thus deferred to the greater, wiser people, so the great-grandfather doesn't have an obligation to learn with his great-grandchild. That would seem to be simply the halach and the laws of Talmud Torah. However, the way that Rashi, quoting the Targum Onkelos, has taught us that Yosef raised his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, the grandchildren of Menashe, which we would assume means to raise, means mainly to raise in Torah. I mean, he raised them. So the question is, why is he teaching them Torah? We just said that it's in the laws of teaching Torah, the obligation to teach your great-grandchild would only be if in general you're the one that needs to be the Torah teacher in this town because you're the greatest scholar. If there's a greater scholar, then you defer to him, then you don't have an obligation to teach your great-grandchild. Your grandchild, yes, that's a personal obligation, but you don't have a personal obligation to your great-grandchild. But here we're seeing that Yosef raised, and we would assume taught Torah. The main thing of raising a child is teaching Torah to his great-grandchild. But we have to assume he wasn't the greatest Torah scholar of his time. Who do we assume is greater? We assume that Yehuda, who was the one sent by Yaakov to designate it as to open a yeshiva in Egypt, he would have been the greatest scholar. Right? Also, we would assume that Yosef was incredibly busy running the country, right? And he wouldn't have an obligation to study with students. So why do we find that Yosef himself engages with his great-grandchildren in teaching them Torah? So what do we see? That Rashi, in his commentary on the Torah, seems to be of the opinion that there's a personal obligation even to teach great grandchildren. And therefore, even though he wasn't the greatest teacher, he still had a personal obligation to teach his great grandchildren. In other words, if there's no personal obligation and the obligation finishes at grandchildren, then you would defer for the great grandchildren, you would defer to the greater scholar. You certainly wouldn't take time off from running a busy operation of this land of Egypt to do something which you're not obligated to do. So it seems that Rashi is learning that he was obligated to do it. Therefore, if it's an obligation, he took time off. And if it's an obligation, doesn't matter there's somebody wiser than him. He has a personal obligation to continue the Torah in his progeny. So that continues, even the obligation continues even to great grandchild. So it would seem we can learn from Rashi. Comes the Rebbe in paragraph 9 and says something fascinating. For this, we have a teaching in actuality that when a Jew is merits to have great grandchildren, he has to learn Torah with them. And if he can't learn with them himself, because he doesn't have any energy, or he just is not equipped to be able to teach Torah, he should give a large amount. It's interesting that Rebbe says, should give a large amount to support the yeshivas that are teaching his great-grandchildren. Especially that our sages taught us with regard to Yaakov, that about Yaakov it doesn't say that Yaakov died. The word Vayigva, he expired, but not Vayomas, he died. Why, says the Gemara? Because he never really died. Ma'azarei b'chaim, the same way his children are alive, afu b'chaim, so he too is alive. What does it mean? It means to say that when somebody's children are still living in the tradition of the father and the grandfather, he never really dies. He lives on through their study. So 1 second. If a person's life is going to be defined by the Torah and mitzvahs and the continuation of Judaism that goes on through his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, so really, he's not just teaching them, he's ensuring his own life. Because this way, he doesn't just take care of their life, he's taking care of his own life. But that's the way he stays alive. So here we see a beautiful way that Rebbe unpacks a Rashi. Shows us how in the Rashi there's so many layers, so many different nuanced things, so much general knowledge we can get. And thank you very much.